We come now to the elephant in the room, which is race. And here we have a film, The River, produced by the New Deal, in which, without any commentary, we see African American slaves in the field, black field workers rolling bales of cotton. And Lorenz purposely includes Robert E. Lee's speech of surrender as a means of ingratiating himself to Southern audiences. And indeed, it's known that when this film, The River, was screened in the South, many in the audience would stand when they saw the words of Robert E. Lee. Also, Lorenz instructed Thomson that he wanted to hear music in the style of minstrelsy, and the log rolling sequence in The River, where the music is a hot time in the old town tonight, is scored with banjo in a minstrel style. Roosevelt, in addition to being an activist president, was a consummate politician. We heard George Stoney talk about how the New Deal looked after poor whites and poor blacks in the South, but as is well known, the New Deal also had to make, or chose to make, a kind of devil's pact with segregation. In order to retain his Democratic base in the South, Roosevelt did not challenge Jim Crow.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. Give me your help not to win votes alone, but to win in this crusade to restore America to its own people.
The New Deal was challenged in the latter part of Roosevelt's administration before the Second World War by politicians who were comfortably in their Democratic seats because of Roosevelt. And but I don't think our overall policies were challenged too much, because it was an understanding that we were somehow preserving the class structure. You see, we never challenged race. Ours was just as segregated as any other government program. We did have a few places where there were consolidated farms. I think they were called test farms, where there were either groups of blacks or groups of whites who were on what was really a kind of farm security plantation. I recall vividly one that was near Tuskegee, and I wanted to do a story about it for the local newspapers. So I went over and I met the young man who was in charge. Now, he was one of the very few college-bred black people employed by the Farm Security Administration, and he was in charge of this farm. Well, there I was, just right out of college myself. There he was, just out of college himself. He was surrounded by illiterate, or almost illiterate, black people. And he was lonely, and I was lonely. And we had a couple of nights talking, and it was just wonderful. Well, you see, we could share meals and so forth because we weren't being watched by anybody. I went back to my office in Montgomery, which is 40 miles away, and a couple of weeks later, I was going into the post office, out the front steps, up going into the door, and he came down, and I said, "Oh, Lord, Larry," and our hands touched, handshake. Well, that was a clear violation of the racial code at the time. And I could still feel his hand. We didn't want to pull our hands away from one another, and yet we knew we should.